Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today I thought it would be a fun topic for us to talk about finishing up a project, or like doing that last 1% that definitely doesn't take 1% of the time you spend on a project. Like the energy and the effort and the willpower it takes to just get over that last little bit is definitely, massively disproportionate for launching a software product. And you get better at it the more you do it, which I think is something hopefully that I can say that is, if I found in my own experience, and is hopefully encouraging if you're coming to development if you're fairly new to this, that it's totally normal for that last little bit of a project where it's like it's almost done but isn't quite done, isn't quite released, to feel like it takes forever. And part of it, I think, in a weird way, is it's like the term software release is very aptly named, because software isn't so much finished as it is like slowly tugged out of our hand, and eventually we just release our grip and it flies out into the world. Like it is never this thing where, at least I've never had the experience, where I feel like I have created this perfectly formed thing that I am now presenting out into the world. It's like at some point you just have to say, this is good enough. I'm going to put this out, and I will fix all the bugs or the issues or the problems later. And I think we've talked many times on episodes previous about the importance of getting something out into the world, because you can get feedback, you can validate the idea, make sure that you're actually building something people want, or not missing like whole aspects of the sort of the problem domain that you're trying to solve that you're just unaware of because you're stuck in your own little world. But more importantly, I think what I would be interesting to focus on for today is some of the little aspects of doing that, of the things that you have to do in that last 1%. And the first thing that I think is worth talking about is deadlines. This is especially complicated, I think, if you're doing this project by yourself or with just with one or two other people, and it isn't something where you have an externally imposed deadline. It's not that you're doing consulting for a client and the client has said, by this date you need to have done this, or you won't get paid, or there'll be some kind of penalty. Like if there's an external deadline, that sort of takes care of itself. But if you don't have one of those, and what I've found for myself is that if I don't have some kind of deadline in mind, and maybe it's slightly squishy, but it shouldn't be so squishy that it's not a deadline. Like it still should have some weight behind it. I find it very hard to really get there, because there is something, I think it's Parkinson's law. It's one of those like management laws where it's like work will expand to fill the time allotted to it. So if you give yourself another month, you will find a month's worth of work to fill that with. And if you give yourself another 2 months, it'll fill indefinitely. And if you don't have a deadline, like you will just keep filling with work forever. It's this never ending, like inflating balloon. And so you have to at some point put a line on it and say, I'm going to get it done by here. That's something that I found really helpful with this, is to start to try and talk to other outside people about your launch. So whether this be someone in the press, with friends, whoever it is, and like start talking around a date. Like I have December 12th as the date that I'm going to launch Workouts++ 2.0. Like that's something that I've started to, sort of socialize and talk about to different people. And now that that's a thing in the world, like it changes it from this vague amorphous thing to something that I have this like personal ownership of making happen. And if I didn't have that, I feel like I would just keep working on this app forever, which is not good for anybody. It's far better to draw a line, cut what I need to cut, narrow it down so that I can get it out there, and then start, iterating on the version that's out in the world, rather than just getting stuck, without a deadline, without any sense of, end in mind.
Yeah. I mean, I have found that most of my releases have basically been working, all month or a year or 6 months or whatever, working for a very long span on a kind of unending list of features that like everything is like, if it would be nice if I had time, I can do this. And very few of the features are actually required. And so the amount of time that I'm working on these releases is pretty open-ended. And without any kind of external deadline imposing on me, like the release of a new version of iOS or new Apple hardware or something like that, they would just go on forever. And usually when I do finally release something, it is planned almost no time in advance. And one day I just I'm like, you know what? I'm done. I just want this to be out there. I'm tired of it not being released. So I'm just going to release it like tomorrow or something like that. Like, just a kind of arbitrary decision of, okay, I just need to get this out there. Enough is enough. But a lot of times that, it takes me a long time to get to.
Do you think that kind of slightly arbitrariness to it works in your favor, or is it like a problematic? Like, it seems like it could go both ways, that in some ways it's helpful because you're not creating this sort of any internal stress that about something. You're just kind of working, and at some point you're just like, this is good, and just ship it. Like, do you find that to be helpful, or is that problematic?
It's one of the many ways that I think and work that are probably not ideal, but that also I probably will never change about myself. So I just have to basically, take the good and the bad that comes with it. I think that there's a lot of things that are bad about this kind of capricious or rash decision making. Sometimes it's not a good time to release that thing, it turns out, which I find out later. Or sometimes, it would have benefited from a stronger and more considered marketing push, maybe. But the reality is that I also then am rarely in the position where I have to wait forever. I'm rarely in the position of designing myself into such a corner or having such a huge list of what needs to be done before the release that it never comes out. Like, no one's ever waiting years for an Overcast update. The way I work ensures that something will get released on a fairly regular interval, and I will never know until it's actually released what features will end up making it before that deadline comes or not. The self-imposed arbitrary deadline that was declared 2 days ago.
Yeah, because the thing that I find that I need something a bit more than that. There's certainly small feature updates or bug fixes and stuff where, there's not a sense of kind of planfulness with it. But I think something that I would struggle with your approach is the sense of, like, I find my apps, when I start to work on anything big, the overall quality of the app from a stability or a bugginess perspective, like, drops somewhat precipitously. And then it'll gradually work its way back up to good again, over the course of time. And I feel like for me anyway, I find it's important to have something in mind that I know how much time do I have to keep breaking things before I have to switch things around to just fixing things. And that might just be the way that I develop, that, like, I tend to I tend to sort of take everything apart and then put it back together again, rather than fixing things. It's in a way that is probably a bit more elegant or straightforward, where, if something isn't done, it could just be left out, or at any point, I know this happens. You hear about this a lot with web development type of things, where, sort of everything that's in your master branch is always ready for production, and nothing that touches that is, should ever not be ready for that, which is like the opposite of what I do. I just have, it's like things go from great, horribly broken, back to great, back to horribly broken for me. And so I need some sense of endpoint that I'm aiming at in order to get things turned around and fixed. Otherwise, I'd find myself in a lot of trouble if I was like, you need to release this in 2 days. It's like, I need like a week to put it all back together again. Might just be the way that I work.
Yeah, I do the exact same thing. But like, basically, like, when I decide enough is enough, I need to release this. That just becomes my number one to-do item, is just let's close all this back up again. Let's fix what's broken. I mean, if too much is broken and I can't do that quickly, then okay, I won't release it yet. But usually the things that I break horribly are the first things that I fix in the middle, during a development cycle for release. And then everything after that is either minor polish items, which are easy to basically like knock them all out and clean it up like in 1 or 2 days at the end once you decide you're done, or additional features that aren't really necessary or that are more self-contained, so that, like, if I have to disable an entire feature for a release and just ship it later, I can do that fairly easily with preprocessor macro definitions or commenting out some things or things like that. But that it doesn't usually come to that for me for whatever reason. Usually, whatever I make, I ship soon afterwards because I've gotten pretty good at the mad rush at the end to just polish all the rough edges and fix the remaining bugs of what I have and then just ship what I have. But it's more of a mode switch for me to stop making new stuff at that point and to just only focus on making what I have releasable.
Yeah, and I think it sounds like there's a similarity that I have where as I'm developing, I tend to have a very high level sort of feature list of kind of the things that I'm trying to accomplish in an update or in a release. And then at a certain point, I switch from that kind of a sort of to-do list to what I call kind of a punch list, which I think is a term from construction for when they're when you're kind of finishing up a house. But you switch to this kind of this different mode where the only things that are on your list are things that need to be fixed. You're no longer creating anything. All you're doing is fixing things that are broken. And so it changes the nature of it because that list, hopefully anyway, sort of by necessity will shrink to zero over time. Whereas your feature list or your idea list or your more creative list can grow indefinitely and probably should grow indefinitely in some ways. It's great when you can come up with new ideas for your app, when you can come up with it's awesome that when you start using something for a while, then you're like, hey, what if it did this? What if it did that? Those are awesome. But I have to force myself to start, right now I have two lists in my sort of to-do list manager. I have one for the punch list for Workouts++ 2.0, and then I have the everything else list. And any idea or feature, anything that I have that's an idea for Workouts++ at this point that isn't actively fixing a problem in the app right now goes onto the second list and won't be looked at until I get this release out. The only thing that's on my list now is all these sort of broken items, anything that needs to be dealt with. And I tend to get into a nice sort of cycle with those where I'll sit down, I'll try and knock out, 3 or 4 of those. I'll do either an internal beta or, maybe send it out to a few people, go through the app, see if anything's broken, and repeat. And it tends to, in a good way, sort of narrow in nicely where, just maybe when I first switch over from feature to punch list, maybe, I have 40 items on my punch list, lots of things are a little broken. And then, I just sort of do a cycle through. Now there's 20 things, and now there's 10 things. Now there's 5 things. Now there's 3 things. I'm just going to have to live with those and I'll ship. That pattern seems to work pretty well for me. And it's important, I think, more importantly, rather than how you do that, is having that mindset switch where at the end you have to have the discipline to say, I'm not going to add any more features at this point. It's just fixing stuff. Because if you don't draw that line at some point, it just expands forever. But having that mindset switch to, is it broken or is it an enhancement? And if it's an enhancement, it goes in the next bucket. And it's important, I think, to have that other bucket. I would drive myself crazy if I didn't have a place that I knew I was going to look at that idea in the future. Because I want to build it. I want to do that. But it's I need to have a place to say, you will look at that, whatever, in my case, on December 13th, you can look at that feature. You can look at that idea and work out if it's a good idea. But for right now, if it isn't broken, then it's not going to get fixed.
Speaking of knowing when things are broken, our sponsor this week is Pingdom. You can monitor your websites and servers. Start today at pingdom.com/relayfm. You will get a 14-day free trial. And when you enter offer code RADAR at checkout, you'll get 30% off your first invoice. Pingdom is focused on making the web faster and more reliable for everybody by offering powerful and easy-to-use monitoring tools and services. So, for example, you can monitor the availability and performance of your server, database, or website by using more than 70 global test servers that emulate visits to your site, checking its availability as often as once every minute. Websites are so sophisticated and potentially complicated these days, and very often include several different dependencies, such as contact forms, e-commerce checkouts, logins, search, so much more. And Pingdom makes it possible to monitor the availability and performance of all of these key interactions people have with your site. Because stuff breaks on the internet all the time. Every month, they detect 13 million outages at Pingdom. That is more than 400,000 outages a day. So whether you have a small site or you're managing a complete infrastructure, it is very important to monitor its availability and performance. And Pingdom is great. I have used Pingdom since long before they were a sponsor. I used them all the way back at Tumblr, and I as soon as I set up Instapaper, I set up Pingdom immediately. Then as soon as I set up Overcast, I set up Pingdom there. It is wonderful. I've used it all this time because it is great. I love knowing when stuff is slowing down or broken or down. It is very, very useful to know because you want to know before all your customers or your audience finds out. You want to know that first. You can go fix it before too many people see it. So all you do is give Pingdom a URL to monitor. If you want any kind of custom conditions or logins, you can do that too, but you don't need to. They take care of the rest. You are immediately notified, whatever means you want, SMS, push notification, email, and you can fix the error before too many people see it. Check it out today, pingdom.com/RelayFM for a 14-day free trial, and use code RADAR at checkout to get 30% off your first invoice. Thank you to Pingdom for supporting this show and Relay FM.
So as we're recording, you just released Forecast, your MP3 encoder, metadata manager, chapter maker tool to the world finally. And I know this has been a long time coming. I don't know exactly when you started working on this tool, but it seems like it was forever ago. And I was curious if you had any thoughts about what got you through that last 1% to finally actually ship it, put it out in the world, and sort of start that next phase of its lifespan.
I'd wanted to release Forecast for a while, and I had waited in part for the MP3 patents to expire, the last of which expired this past spring. So I could have released it really anytime after that safely, and I intended to, but then basically throughout the summer and fall, Overcast was basically on fire. Between iOS 11 and drag and drop, and then the iPhone 10, Overcast has been consuming almost all of my development time. I have touched Forecast very little in the last year, just because Overcast just was needier than I expected, and so what finally pushed me to release this. I mean, I've been using this, both myself and in a small private beta with some of our friends who are also podcasters, for like 2 years. and so I knew like the functionality of it worked. The app still had a rough edge, a bunch of rough edges, and it still does because it's a Mac app, and I am terrible at making Mac apps, and I'm very, very new to it. AppKit is very little like UIKit. It's very different, and there's still a lot of legacy to be aware of, a lot of rough edges, a lot of things you have to consider. A lot of functionality that is simply just doesn't work, and iOS has a lot of this too. But I know what it is on iOS. I've been there for so long. I have a lot of experience there. On the Mac, it's all new to me. It's all unfamiliar, and the amount of available help on the Mac is way smaller. You can't just do a web search for some problem you're having and get 1,000 Stack Overflow results about the answers. No, for Mac problems, you're lucky to get one. You might get two, maybe, but you're probably only going to get 0 or 1 answer to what you're looking for. And it might be on some ancient mailing list that's impossible to skim or find. So Mac development is very slow going. So part of why I haven't released it yet is because it wasn't, the app wasn't very pretty or polished. And so I was afraid to release it, because I was afraid that people would judge it on these superficial but still important qualities that I'm just not very good at on the Mac yet, and I might never be. So that was part of it. But, our conversation last week was a pretty big motivator for me to go into let's just release this mode. Because, last week we basically, I talked with you about how how I decided basically that it should be free because it has benefits to me beyond just money. Like it benefits Overcast, it benefits podcasts as a whole, It saves people time, and it can generate a lot of goodwill for Overcast. So I figured, like, based on that rationale, if it's going to be free, then I have a lot less to worry about. I can pull out a lot of like weird license checking code, and I don't have to worry about like in-app purchases or the Mac App Store or anything like that, like building some kind of storefront for the website and then supporting paid. Like the number of things you have to do and worry about and manage if it's free drops down tremendously. And then also I figured, like, well, I want to start accruing those benefits now. All those benefits they're going to have to Overcast and to podcasting and everything. Like, why keep this private any longer? Like, this is probably good enough to release for free right now. And so I basically went into, punch list mode. As you said, like, I fixed the few remaining bugs. I cleaned up. I disabled some experimental stuff that I decided was a dead end. I polished up some of the rough edges, and I released it. Now, the process of releasing a Mac app when you've mostly not released a Mac app before. I did release Quitter before, so I have one Mac app that doesn't even have a window, really. Oh, no, it does. I guess the preferences window. But yeah, like, it's one very small Mac app that lives in the menu bar and does very little. So that was a little bit easier. But when you release apps outside of the Mac App Store, and I don't want to get too much into that, but once I decided that this was not going to be paid, the Mac App the argument to be in the Mac App Store basically evaporated, because it's the complexity of doing that and maintaining a different version that was sandboxed versus not sandboxed for the it was not worth it. And maybe down the road it will be, but right now it's not. So I decided, but when you're not in the Mac App Store, you basically have to build iTunes Connect from scratch for yourself. Like, I think us iOS developers have we take a lot of things for granted, and like things like updates. Like, how does your app update itself if it's not in an app store? And so what Mac apps do is they have this framework called Sparkle, usually that is like the auto updating framework that everyone has seen the windows of, but maybe you don't know what it's called. But almost all apps use this on the Mac. But you have to then have an RSS feed on your server that tells the app installations like what version is available. You have to have a like signature workflow on it to sign your updates to make sure that it's coming from you, and then you have to have some kind of way to manage these builds and validate them. And so before, when I was just doing the Forecast beta and for Quitter, I just have a couple of local shell scripts that do all this, and it's kind of it's pretty crappy, but it's pretty basic needs on those. For Forecast, it's an Overcast product, so I decided it should be part of the Overcast website, and that I wanted some kind of web management panel to do these things. So like basically yesterday I built all of this. I basically built myself a crappy, small, limited version of iTunes Connect.
Nice.
that like I upload a build, it reads the plist, it pulls out the keys for like build number and version number and everything, and it sticks it all in a database, and I can edit the release notes, which is also good because then I can provide a version history on the website very, very easily because it's all in a database. So, edit the release notes for it, be able to publish it or have it not be published yet. I'm going to create a beta channel, which I haven't done yet, but it's basically just, and not even to the level of sophistication iTunes Connect had, just like a granularity of like, is this version on the beta train or not? And then have a separate feed for that. Then it's all on the Overcast site, and then it runs through the Overcast CDN, so I don't have to worry about like download, overloads or overages. So it was a lot of work to build all that, but and this is like, it's one of those things like the first time you make a Mac app, you learn all this crazy stuff. I mean, just like, I guess similarly, the first time somebody makes an iOS app, and you learn about like all the provisioning stuff that you have to do and certificates and everything else. So I guess it isn't that different of an amount of work, but certainly the first time you build all this, it's a lot, and this is all even easier because it's free. Like, if it was actually paid and I had my own storefront on my website, I have to build that and manage that, and that's not a small thing either. So there's a lot that you have to do in the Mac world that you don't have to do in iOS, at least if you don't do the App Store. And it's kind of made me appreciate, like, oh, this is why people still use the App Store. Like, not everyone uses it. A lot of big developers don't, because they have the resources not to. But certainly, if you are a small developer and you just want to put something up, charge a few bucks for it or whatever, the App Store is way easier than doing it yourself. It's not even close. I guess they get that 30% for a reason. So ultimately, it was a ton of work, almost none of which was the Forecast app itself. Like almost all of it was putting together the infrastructure, making a page for it on the site, writing what's on the page, taking a screenshot, putting that on the page. Like it's all this work that we have when we release a new app, especially if it's the first app for a certain platform that we've released. There's so much work to do that, it's like that last 1%, as you said, like the last 1% is ridiculous when it's like your very first Mac app that you've ever made. Like you make this happen somehow. Like it's so much work, and it's nowhere near polished or done, but it's close enough. It's functional, and so I just shipped it.
Yeah, and I think too, there's a more general point that I hear you saying is it's important to remember too that there may be a lot of things that you have to do before you, even when you finally get to the point that you let go and say, yep, this is good enough, I'm going to put this in the store. Like there's still the work is not done at that point. The work may be done in Xcode. Like you may have, finally uploaded your binary to iTunes Connect, or in your case, like Overcast Connect. But like then you have all these other stuff that you have to do. Like, are you going to do any kind of frequently asked questions, or do you have to build a website for it? Are you there's any kind of marketing materials, even just the iTunes Connect kind of screenshotting and all that kind of stuff. Like if you have a localized set of screenshots, like it takes a good day whenever I need to update my screenshots. Even when I automate a lot of it, like just because I think Pedometer++ is localized into 10 languages or something like that. And so if I have, multiple 5 screenshots times 10, times 10 languages times multiple devices, like it just goes crazy. And it's important, I think, to keep that in mind too, that if you have set a deadline and you have communicated that you need to leave buffer in your workflow so that you have time to do all this stuff that is, that has nothing to do with finishing the app, that you finally got your punch list down to, good enough, you're done. It's like you still have a bunch of other stuff that you're going to have to do. And so just like leaving enough buffer in your schedule to actually do that is important. Like I know I've gotten caught out for iOS updates where it's like I feel like I'm working towards making it so that as soon as the Gold Master version of Xcode comes out and as soon as iTunes Connect opens up, I'm ready to go. And then I've forgotten that I'm going to need a whole new set of screenshots. And so rather than submitting right that moment, I'm submitting like a day later. And so that's just entirely poor planning on my part.
Yeah, screenshots are my Achilles heel. They always take me, like I always forget that I have to do them. And then at the very last minute, I'm like, oh crap, I need to make 40 screenshots. This is bad. And then, then I have to figure out some way to try to automate some of it. I know there's tools out there to help with this, but I've never bothered to set one up. And so that's a big deal. This is one of the reasons why I haven't made app preview videos yet. I probably should make videos just to try them out. But I haven't yet, in part because that's a massive undertaking to add to this. To add like the production of an entire video to the list of things you have to do every time your UI changes, like or every time a new device comes out. That's a large amount of work. And so, it has to be pretty compelling, and I haven't had the time to do it yet. But now Forecast is out. It's mostly stable. I don't think I need to do a whole lot of work on it release wise. Overcast is pretty stable, so I'm back in a good place now. But man, that last 1% on both of those things was killer.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's fun is like now you're in the place that is, at least if you're anything like me, is the best part, right? Now you can look at your big long feature list, and you're like the reward for battling through that last 1% is that you now have the opportunity to look at your like fun feature list and decide what's fun to work on next. And like that's in a weird way, it's like as an engineer, like the best reward for lots of hard work is more hard work. But at least it's like the fun work that I enjoy doing rather than the hard, like the grunt work that I don't enjoy doing as much.
Exactly. All right, we're out of time this week. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.